because I'm starting to notice a lot of issues within fandoms and fan communities, and I want to address that in the first episode so that we're all on the same page. So first off, let's just discuss fandoms before we even get into any Snydercut information and things of that nature. There's fandoms for everything. All right, so there is no one solid fan. You may be a comic book fan, a comic book fan, and the films may not appeal to you, and that can happen because the comics and the films are not exactly the same. They're more adaptations, and especially for some franchises that have had iterations before, you'd have to update it. You don't want to always retell the same exact story, but you do want to pay homage, like most films do, to the other films that came before it. But most importantly, the source, basically. And when you're dealing with comic books, you have information coming from, like, depending on which character, anywhere from 50 to 60 to 70, over 70 years of canon and information that it's it's kind of hard to kind of condense and keep it into one film. So usually people will select certain comic book writers, some of their runs that they were more familiar with, and then they'll go with that. So I mean, just like most directors, they'll gather up all the comic books that they've seen, and then they'll find the ones that are most interesting to them and the most interesting story to them that can make them flesh out the character while injecting a lot of different information and source points and things that could remind you from the lineage of the carrier of the character to ensure and make sure that you actually hit all the hallmarks of the character. Because at the end of the day, these characters should remain have an iconic aesthetic. And I'm not just dealing with just the physical aesthetic, if you will. You want to get garner the mental aesthetic. You want to gain the 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 personality aesthetic. So the characters will always remain hallmark to who they are, that it will stand the test of time. So you could always point out, no matter what generation, you could always say, hey, I know that Batman, I know that Superman, I know that they they far extend past their writers. Even the writers are still working with some tenets that makes the character who they are. And sometimes there's been times where, depending on the timeline, they have to change the whole dynamic of the character because it's been years. They're no longer high school, or you're aging them up, and certain experiences. And after a certain amount of years where the character dwells in a one space, there'll always be a writer that wants to take them out of that environment to kind of mess with their personality, if you will, just so they could tell more interesting stories. And that's going to happen. And you got to remember, these comics actually extend generations of writers as well. So just when there's a comic book reader that's been reading this since they're a child and they're in their like 20s or 30s and they're just kind of getting off, and especially back in the day when you had to really adult at an earlier age, there wasn't so many adult readers, at least at the volume that we have today, overtly. you know it started to be like a very niche thing for adults because a lot of kids went through the comic book phase and left. Of those that were hardcore comic book readers, they stayed. Obviously, they're the people that eventually went on to own comic book shops, obviously. And I've seen people in suit and ties in the comic book shop as well. It's always been, you can kind of tell that's their thing on the inside. I still read comics, but I do other things in my life. So you're going to have readers crossing different generations. So in order to get new readers, you need to update the world that they living in. I mean, Spider-Man can't remain in high school from the 60s. You understand what I'm saying? After a while, it's going to be obvious. And as the people that were reading them in the 60s get older, they need him to get older with them so that the real world applications, at least as real as it can be with respect to the comic book series, of course. You want to make them feel like they're transitioning into different stages of life so they can still have the comic book aesthetic, but also with the mindset of an adult now that the characters are getting older. But then you're trying to bring in new characters as well. So there's always going to be stories telling from different time points just to keep readers going along. And when I came into reading Spider-Man, Spider-Man wasn't a kid anymore. He was an adult. To me, he was in his late 20s, early 30s, probably, when I was real small reading him. It wasn't until they started doing the Ultimates version where they wanted to really start the kid stuff again, or you had to like watch the cartoons. And if there was a cartoon starting from that point when he was in high school, then you would read it. Most of them kind of was around college. I know like the Fox series was, I feel like Fox series, nah, he wasn't in, was he still? No, he was out of college, or he was just getting out of college, if I'm not mistaken. When he did the animated series that was on Fox. So again, I mean, like when you take him out of the schooling backdrop, being a kid, and he's just an adult. When you're a kid, it's good to aspire to be adult, but it's even better when you're watching series where they're actually in high school with you, because then you grow and develop a certain level of attachment with it, because you're kind of growing up along with the characters. So a lot of their personal issues will be very simplistic, as it pertains to high schools, liking a girl, whatever, certain social things that pertain to growing up. So when you want to cross all these generational time zones, you're going to have to update the story, update the books, and it's no different than the comic book movies. They're trying to do things where they're pulling from different environments so they can make sure they get the comic book people, but most importantly, you want to get the new people. The comic book people are going to show up regardless. At the end of the day, comic book fans, we're going to show up for it because we're just into that type of shit. So you're going to cater towards new goers and new readers, or new visitors, and you want to make it easy for them to walk into the story and get it. So you want to start the origin off and all of that. Now, like with the MCU, they don't really need to. They could kind of go over the origins quick. They kind of at their liberty now to get away with a lot more. It's a lot more malleable because they got a lot more eyes onto it. Now more than ever, people are more abreast about comic book films, and they're knowing a lot more lore that come from the comic books, even though it's not 100% accurate. It's been manipulated to tell the story that they have. In order to get those new viewers, now you have to adapt to the times. And that's the point. And I think what's happening is a lot of people don't realize that in order to do that is you're going to need quite an orchestrator, if you will. You're going to need quite an orchestrator to make that move and make it fluid, because the people that are the vocal majority are the comic book readers, the comic book fans. But again, it goes back to who are the fans. If you're a comic book fan, you might not like the films. If you're a film fan, you might not too care for the comic books. I mean, there are different types of fan communities now. And with so many different fringe fan communities, you can't really say, oh, it's an insult to the fans. Which ones? I read Spider-Man comics since I was a little boy, favorite superhero. Even though I had times where I'll relate to other comic book characters more, but Spider-Man has always been my favorite. And the funny thing is, if you ever really listen to me, I'm more into more mature, darker, if you will, but more those type of aesthetics. But I like all comic book movies just off general principle. But if you gave me one to write and whatnot, I would probably do something more grounded. But that's the kind of my nature, depending on, now maybe depending on the character, I might go a different way because I got different ideas that you can go with. But needless to say, my go-to is more, if you ever seen any of the type of stuff that I was into, it would be more grounded and I guess in a way a little bit more dark or more mature. I would rather say filmmaking, even for comic book movies, because I feel like there's so many different ways you could do that and make it a lot more intriguing. But just because that's the route I would go, that doesn't mean that every time I watch a comic book movie, that's what I'm looking for. I'm just looking for you to tell me the film that you got for me within the context in the world that you have for it. And that's the best way to approach watching a film, because now you're not going in it with any intentions. You're going into it with nor expectations. You're going into it with an honest, I don't want to say awe if that's the most accurate way of putting it, but you're going in there with an honest intent, if that's the best way to put it. You're really just looking to see a good film, and however it brings you in, it brings you in. And unfortunately, because we have so many different fringe fan communities now, you got fans arguing amongst themselves who's more of a fan. And if you ask me, I don't think that's the most appropriate way to deal with fan communities and any type of issues, if you will, concerning anything with regards to the Snyder Cut. I really do feel that if you really, when you argue from a standpoint of fans, you have to be very clear on who the fans are. Because if I'm a fan of the films, I'm a fan of the Snyder films. I am. I like Aquaman, but I do not like it for the world that we started with. If that was the world from the very beginning, Aquaman would have been fine to me. I don't like it going that way because I love the way we started it. More grounded, more. Suicide Squad was disappointing. I enjoyed it for what it was, but it was a big letdown for what I thought it was going to be from watching the trailers. And from what I understand, and we can say release the air cut, it was not what David Ayer intended on it becoming. But that's where it is today. But even though I enjoy it, that doesn't make me less of a fan. And that's the point. You know, I'm more of a fan of what Snyder was how he set it up. There's certain things I didn't like that Snyder did. I do not like the fact that Metropolis and Gotham are right neck across the bay. I hate that concept, to be quite honest. It makes the world so much smaller. And then now it's like, well, if Superman is that close, why isn't he helping out in Gotham? It's gonna make it real murky. I know he had a 5-part story plan, so and the way he did the series, it wasn't going to be as long-winded. It was gonna have a beginning, middle, and end. So it would seem. And if that's the case, then I guess it would be fine. Because then Batman, he intended to die at some point. Because this was Batman in his later career. And then you would have had an opportunity to bring in Terry McGinnis. It was a lot of, with an older Batman, people didn't realize it opened up so much opportunity for storytelling and for characters to already exist. But I want to stay focused on this part of the fandom, and so we can wrap it up. There are different types of fans from different type of small fringe community or underneath the larger comic book film community. There's some that are staunch canonists, if you will, staunch comic bookist, if you will. They really focus on it coming from the source material. There's a lot of different variations of these fringe fan communities. But so to say that just because I'm a fan of, excuse me, all that Snyder did and contributed towards DC, to say that I'm not a real fan would be ridiculous. How am I not a fan? It would make sense. Oh, so you're not a fan of Batman and or Superman? What makes you think I'm not? Now, I kind of read more Batman comics, but I was more Marvel dude. That doesn't make me less a fan of the superheroes, though. But I'll be honest with you, I'm more a fan of the Marvel guy, and this is a guy that's more interested in what Snyder was doing than I am in the Marvel. And it's not, and some of it could be because Marvel been around for a minute, but Marvel is very formulaic. And as much as I love the formula, I'm interested. This what Snyderverse was giving you was stuff with so much more stakes and so new and fresh that it was more interesting to see where they was gonna take their universe. And it was beautiful that they weren't trying to be like each other, and it made it more creative, if you will, in the storytelling, especially for a guy like me. But like I said, that doesn't make me any less of a fan. And I don't think it's fair to berate the fan community just for it, especially Snydercut fans. So that's just my take on the fan community. We're gonna do a lot more discussion pieces on it. I've actually been listening to a lot of fans discussions on it, and it inspired me, at least on this first episode for Road to the Snyder Cut, that we at least discuss that part. And as we move forward, we're gonna get a lot more discussion points that I want to really keep talking about throughout the week. And I'm gonna drop that episode today. We're recording today, and the first episode, I do want it to drop today, but I also want it to keep on going. If I don't drop it today, I'll definitely drop it tomorrow. But I do want it to be something that we could periodically keep on releasing and keep on dropping during the week. This week we've released the my very first video I ever did, my love of Man of Steel, and we'll talk about that a little bit on the first episode. And most importantly, we're gonna just keep on, like I said again, bringing more and more information about what's going on with the Snyder Cut, and just getting into the pocket conversations that's going on. Because, like I said, I've been listening to Snyder people that are against the Snyder Cut, and listening to discussion panels on it. One of note, but I don't really want to make my channel about a bit about making it more personal. It's more about the larger conversation at hand.